Today was going to be such a chill day. Just got some shoes in from Frankworks that I was going to try out. I was going to make a video on my favorite budget paddles at the moment, which, spoiler alert, and everything was going to be hunky-dory. But like clockwork, the pickleball drama wheel never stops turning. And it looks like the last few days is what Selkirk has chosen for writing a couple of letters to the UPA that, for lack of a better phrase, has absolutely bounced their head off the concrete. And of course, I've read both of the letters in their entirety just so that you don't have to. So let's talk about them. I'll start first with the formal letter that Selkirk sent to UPA that's about 10 pages long and follow it up with some thoughts of my own. Alright, so let's get into this. Selkirk begins the letter first and foremost with a blog post that they wrote back on August 16th, which initially begins by stating that they fully support USA Pickleball in the advancement of their testing procedures, especially in an environment where pickleball paddles sent for production to the public and to pros are so much more different than what's sent for USA Pickleball for testing, which I have many thoughts there just right off the bat, but we'll get into those later. The rest of the blog simply talks about how pickleball brings immense emotional, physical, and social benefits, and how amateurs who play the sport for fun are the lifeblood of the sport in the first place, and talks about how manufacturers, companies, and regulatory organizations all have an obligation to protect pickleball and do what's best for the community. And what comes after quoting that blog post is nothing short of a bombardment of accusations from Selkirk at UPA and UPA-A. Selkirk first accuses UPA of colluding with Yola to make sure that the Gen 3S paddles, the first and only UPA-A approved paddles on the market right now, to make sure that they would be just that, the first and only ones, to follow interim UPA-A certification rules that were only made known to the rest of the UPA-A committee about 2 days prior to the PPA event that they would debut at last weekend. When UPA claimed that they had already previously clearly communicated what these rules were going to be, Selkirk picks out 2 sentences in the entire email, which, by the way, was only sent to 10 companies out of the hundreds on the market that would be interested in knowing this information. And in those 2 sentences were where they communicated the 46 kilogram deflection force limit and the 2200 RPM spin limit, which in no way is clear at all. At this point in time, UPA plans to use Pro Pickle Labs, or PPL, as the main testing organization and labs for all of their paddles, and from which they will derive all of their rules for paddle approval. But Selkirk completely slams the idea of there being any mention of any type of PPL standards at all in the current state of the organization, and talks about how the employees of PPL don't even understand simple process or temperature controls, or even really understand how the deflection test itself works. 2 distinct points were made in order to back up these thoughts. Firstly, by saying that every single paddle going through the same deflection test makes more stiff paddles more subject to going out of spec than more flexible paddles. And let's face it, if your paddle's going out of spec after one test, that's probably a bad sign regardless of the face stiffness, but I assume they're talking about over the course of multiple tests. And secondly, if PPL was not going to temperature control their environment, they need to allow paddles 3 to 4 hours of sitting in the temperature that they will be tested in order to make sure that the materials have fully acclimated to the environment. And you can kind of piece together how that would make sense, especially as paddle characteristics are said to change depending on whether or not you say leave it in a hot car in the daytime or leave it in your bag in a temperature controlled room. We even hear anecdotes of pros putting their paddles in freezers or refrigerators because it changes how the paddle performs during testing. Shout out to the Jilly Bee podcast for that little tidbit. And so Selkirk goes on and talks about how trust is now broken because of these issues and blah, blah, blah. And at this point, you begin to wonder, where are these sort of claims coming from? And let me tell you something, Selkirk brings the receipts. So apparently back in March of 2023, Tom Barnes, a co-founder himself of Selkirk, goes on site to the MLP Daytona Beach event in order to observe the first level of PPL's implementation of their testing with Carl SCHMITS. And for those of you who don't know who Carl SCHMITS is, he currently serves as the CTO and the head of an equipment evaluation committee within USA Pickleball, whom PPL claimed to be working in tandem with. Barnes goes on to explain that during his observation, a man named Gary Brody bursts into the room, proceeds to make him feel very unwelcome, and shouting at him even to leave. And when Barnes refuses, Brody proceeds to leave the room. And when he does so, SCHMITS explains to Barnes that Gary Brody is actually the CEO of PPL, and that SCHMITS himself, despite his years and years of experience in equipment testing and pickleball, is only there as part of a figurehead of the process. Barnes states, quote, Carl informed me that he had no influence over the testing process and was not permitted to observe it, contribute to it, or scrutinize it. He was simply there as a figurehead to give faux credibility to the PPL's operation and MLP. Fast forward now to October of 2023, which is still pre-merger between PPA and MLP, where Connor Pardoe, CEO of PPA, and Tom Dundon, the owner of the PPA, are both present. Barnes and his team voiced their concerns at PPL's illegitimacy and honestly the stretch that it is to even call themselves a lab, and says that Pardoe and Dundon were both dismissive about the issue and states that this, quote, was not their impression of PPL. Now we go to a month later in November of 2023, where once again, Tom Barnes is on site, this time at PPA Daytona, to observe the testing procedures. And he says that during this event, amidst testing, without warning anybody, including the pro players themselves, PPL reduces the standards and limits of their deflection test from 50 kilogram limits to 42 kilogram limits. For those of you who might not understand the implications of that, the deflection test works by looking at the amount of force it takes to push a paddle face inward by a certain measurement, which by most accounts I'm hearing is about 2 millimeters. So the more force it takes to push a paddle face inward, the harder it is for that face to flex, which ideally should mean less energy returned to the ball, making the paddle less hot. Barnes talks about how the number of paddles that were failing testing drastically reduced from one day to the next. And when he inquired about it, PPL CEO Gary Brody placed the blame on deflection test implementer Curtis Cruz, who then placed the blame back onto Gary Brody and created a circle of confusion. And the last event that Barnes brings up in this timeline occurred just last month in July of 2024 at the MLP Grand Rapids event, where PPL actually suspended deflection testing in its entirety for the entire day on the second day of the event. So on top of them taking it more than a day to realize that their equipment was faulty, not only were less paddles failing the next day, but also they were claiming that people could come back and pick up paddles that had previously failed the day prior and use them as approved paddles. And then they proceeded to reinstate the deflection testing the next day of the event. It's an absolutely insane saga that goes to show PPL's incompetency of registering their own tests over a timeline of more than a year. As another layer to the incompetency, Selkirk talks about how PPL doesn't even have a baseline testing available to make sure that their metrics are accurate, and it leads them to develop an internal audit system that follows ISO and ASTM protocols, both of which are just organizations that develop standards for testing materials. And they request that the UPA review their documentation and review their processes and try to adopt some form of them before even new deflection technology is being introduced in 2025. And the last few things noted here before we get to the call to action that Selkirk provides is that they rip into the message that UPA provided to the organizations on August 15th, which included some of the testing standards that they will follow. For example, the 2200 RPM testing limit is being tested by firing a ball at 40 miles per hour at a static paddle held at 25, 30, and 35 degree angles. We'll get to how absurd that is in a second. Selkirk talks about how the UPA and PPL are losing trust due to their lack of transparency, that they can't even receive metrics about their own paddles from testing, that the CEO of PPL, Gary, is completely incompetent, and the UPA response that Gary is cool or Gary is fun is not enough to reconcile that, and that PPL itself is a huge money grab in the sport of pickleball, and that without major changes, UPA is heading down the same path. It's hard to even say that with a straight face, that the UPA said Gary is cool, Gary is fun. Gary is not beating the cool and fun allegations. It kind of actually makes me want to meet him a little bit. And in the call to action, Selkirk mainly wants two things. They want an independent audit of the testing protocols, and they volunteered their own services if they aren't willing to get an independent contractor, which heads up UPA-A, don't do that. And secondly, they want a revocation of the entire UPA-A interim certification system because the protocols were not made clear to the whole organization and the entire sport of pickleball. The last couple of sentences of the formal letter read, quote, "We are all fed up with UPA, UPA-A, and PPL's reckless ready, fire, aim approach to decision making. It's impacting our lives, harming the pros, and negatively affecting the entire pickleball community." And to sum all of this up, Selkirk lays out the two options that they claim the UPA has if they want continued input and participation from Selkirk. Option 1 has several layers, including having engineers run PPL, having PPL and UPA both be registered as nonprofits, reducing the certification fee, which right now is rumored to be upwards of $70,000 annually per company, having Jason Aspis remove himself with all ties to the kitchen, especially financially, and also having the interim UPA-A standards removed. And the second option is much more straightforward. They go back to USAP testing. They say that USAP has made strides in improving their testing protocols and improving their transparency, and of course they are registered as a nonprofit. But in all honesty, other than the whole nonprofit thing, I would call BS on those other two factors. I'll leave you guys with just a couple of thoughts and things to think about before I wrap up, which, I mean, first of all, wow, that was a lot. In honesty, it sounds like Selkirk is saying a lot of things that were on a lot of people's minds. They're not only right in that regulatory organizations and companies have a huge responsibility to the pickleball community in order to maintain certain standards, but they've also outlined so many issues with the UPA's way of testing that, unfortunately, I have heard from multiple sources. I've heard that the UPA has communicated, or at least that information was leaked and it's been rumored, that they're going to be testing deflection force at 46 kilograms for approval and 42 kilograms on site, which once again, as a reminder, would allow companies to send in paddles that pass a certain deflection point and then have pros arrive to tournaments with paddles that theoretically should be much hotter. The spin testing protocols are also something that I've been hearing about behind the scenes, and to see that these are actually the testing protocols that are confirmed from the UPA is absolutely absurd. Just thinking about this from a physics standpoint in general, shooting a ball at 40 miles per hour, which by the way is slower than a lot of pros are going to be able to drive the ball, especially with the new power paddles on the market, at a static paddle held at an angle is simply not going to generate much spin at all, because most of the energy is going into the paddle as opposed to exhibiting the actual spin that's produced from the grit. Especially when we're talking about a ball with holes in it, think about the grittiest paddle face that you have ever felt and multiply that by at least 2 to 3. And that is the amount of grit on a paddle that's going to be required to fail the testing the way that UPA has set it up. It's absolutely ridiculous. Other than that, I think Selkirk makes a couple good and a couple of bad points in terms of what to do moving forward. I think it would be a terrible move by UPA to have just another big company come in and do their audits. There's just simply too many conflicts of interest there. And I also think that Selkirk's notion that USAP is improving their processes and improving their transparency is also completely false, because where are those standards from USAP? It's the same reason why nobody understands why the new mod TAs from YOLA are legal. It's because USAP has done nothing in the way of increasing their transparency, or at least letting us know what their new testing protocols that they're working towards are. Alright, if you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching and for your support per usual. Remember to like and subscribe for more content like this covering the drama, and of course my paddle reviews and giveaways. It sounds like Gary doesn't know how to run a pickleball testing organization, but he does sound like a cool guy. Gary, if you're watching this, go ahead and let me know if you're a cool guy. Shoot me a DM, drop a comment on the YouTube video. Let's play a game together. You sound cool and fun. Come on, man. Let's make it happen. I hope I covered all of your questions, but of course, if I didn't, go ahead and let me know in the comments, or just drop your opinions on the overall scenario. I want to hear from you guys. Go ahead and let me know down below. And I hope you all, most importantly, stay happy and healthy until the next video. Peace.